Are we recording yet, Maggie? Okay. Thanks. So as chair of the Plant Conservation Alliance Federal Committee, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lauren Weisenberger, who began her career in plant conservation in Hawaii at the Lyon Arboretum Seed Conservation Laboratory, as a student hire, which grew into a rare plant management position over 14 years as a University of Hawaiʻi contractor to research and stabilize several dozen endangered plant species found on U.S. Army lands on the island of Oʻahu. In 2012, Lauren and a colleague, Matt Keir, is it Keir? Okay, thanks. Were contracted by the National Tropical Botanical Garden to determine whether a plant conservation network in Hawaii would be beneficial. The Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation was then drafted, and Laukahi, the Hawaiʻi Plant Conservation Network, was established in 2014. In 2016, Lauren started a new position as the Plant Recovery Coordinator at the Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office, overseeing recovery of efforts for 442 threatened and endangered plant taxa in Hawaii and the Mariana Islands. Without further ado, and speaking to us about tracking progress on the Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation, let's welcome Lauren Weisenberger.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen.
Lauren, I forgot to mention, sorry. If folks have questions, if you could save them for the end, if you'd like to, you can throw them in the chat and we will read them at the end, unless you're experiencing any kind of technical difficulty. All right, thanks.
Thanks. Can you guys see the presentation? Does that look right?
Let me just see if it's just the way. Yes, it looks fine.
Okay. All right. I have the chat hidden or anything, so just let me know if you need me to stop or anything, or if there's any questions. So thanks so much, Patricia. Thanks everyone for having me. As Patricia mentioned, and as I introduced myself, I'm a botanist at Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office. I'm also a member on the advisory council for Laukahi, the Hawaiʻi Plant Conservation Network, which is what I'll be speaking about today, and our efforts towards tracking progress on the Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation. I just wanted to say that the network coordinator position is currently open, and I am filling in today, so please bear with me. So what is Laukahi? Laukahi in Hawaiian can mean single leaf, but if you break it down further, lau as a noun means leaf of a plant or the end of a pointed object. As a verb, it means to produce leaves, to be numerous, to reach out. And as a number, it can mean much, many, numerous. Kahi, as it relates to numbers, means one single soul, together as a unit, to unite. So it can be interpreted as many as one. As a name, it refers to several native Hawaiian ferns that have a prominent single frond, or the native species of Plantago, which have simple undivided leaves, as you can see here. Plantago has been used as medicine to treat sores, bites, blood infections, high blood pressure. Laukahi can also be a place name. And as an organization, Laukahi is a collaborative movement that aims to implement the Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation and tracks all data surrounding plant conservation work in Hawaii. Each leaf is a partner, united in achieving more than we could alone. Within many ahupua'a or gulches or watersheds throughout the Hawaiian Islands, you can find pockets of native forest or habitat, dozens of endangered species, and unfortunately, many more non-native and largely invasive species and disturbed, poorly functioning habitats. The dollars that have been spent, and largely by the government agencies, target protecting watersheds and preventing extinctions. But of course, more dollars are needed. As a conservation community at the time, we spent many years focused on preventing extinctions, but knew there was so much more to do, but limited resources to do so. So how did Laukahi become a network? The question was posed in 2012 of whether there was a benefit of establishing a plant conservation network in Hawaii to increase the impact of the existing conservation efforts while searching for additional new sources of funding. This project produced a report and publication on that assessment of the status, capacity, and needs for Nc2 conservation of the Hawaiian flora, and outlines the value of establishing a network of plant conservation programs. It identified the foundation of the network as the Hawaiʻi Seed Bank Partnership. The Hawaiʻi Seed Bank Partnership became the foundation because collecting fruits from native plants was a primary conservation action identified, and the value in sharing the data and feedback on how best to collect, store, germinate, and propagate plants of native Hawaiian plants was enormous. So we learned so much more about propagular handling, germination, seed storage behavior from the work with rare plants that we wanted to use that as a method to apply what we learned to the flora as a whole. The existing seed banks immediately began meeting to discuss standard operating procedures and protocols and how best to share information we knew about seed biology, germination, and storage behavior. The meetings became larger, workshops were held, and the Hawaiʻi Seed Bank Partnership grew. We worked closely with CPC to make sure our recommendations are in sync. Our seed banking efforts and funding are largely driven by rare plant conservation, but there's loads of work to be done and interest in conducting more habitat restoration, and scaling up operations to include more seed banking for restoration is ongoing. I see similarities in the connection of this effort to the National Seed Strategy. There have been limitations in Hawaii, such as not having Bureau of Land Management lands to further integrate into Seeds of Success, but Laukahi has been able to bring together many of the landowners and programs that are actively working on seed collections for restoration. I really appreciate the opportunity and partnering that the PCA provides in the hopes to increase Laukahi's ability to support habitat restoration. So to expand Laukahi's platform from the Hawaiʻi Seed Bank Partnership Foundation, it adopted the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which was developed by the Convention on Biological Diversity and adjusted the targets to fit within the existing efforts in Hawaii. The vision of the global strategy is without plants, there is no life. The functioning of the planet and our survival depends on plants. This was adopted by the Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation with the Olelo or Hawaiian saying, Iola oi, Iola makune. My life is dependent on yours, and your life is dependent on mine. This also aligns with the interpretation of the meaning of Laukahi, many as one, and hence the name was adopted to represent the network. Our first step was to describe and identify species of conservation importance. So I'll be referring to species of conservation importance, or SCI, throughout the presentation. While there was much we wanted to know about the flora as a whole, we started by identifying species in need of conservation actions. So we identified those species, which was roughly half of the flora, on whether or not they were rare, so identified by our partners or programs as rare, whether or not they were in management plans, such as the state's Wildlife Action Plan, and whether or not they had cultural value or were in cultivation. We continuously discuss which species are species of conservation importance and whether all native species are, which by the literal definition, the answer would be yes. But we also want to be able to track information on all these species and therefore rely upon observations and collaborations with partners. The next steps were to create targets that align with the global objectives and the global strategy, figure out how many people are needed to implement and oversee this effort, what research and planning was needed, and then how to start a statewide plant conservation network. Next, we invested in how to promote the network and gain attention, members, and support. We drafted action plans that identified discrete, fundable projects that would help us meet our goals. And the objectives in the global strategy and our goals helped to identify 20 targets. The objectives highlight 5 major topics the targets fall under, including documenting and understanding the status and biology of the flora, the Nc2 habitat protection and fieldwork necessary to preserve it, the outreach and workforce necessary to implement it, as well as the impact of the value of the flora. Laukahi wants to show the collective impact of everyone's work within the targets. The targets span from Nc2 protection, Nc2 conservation and research, but also metrics around sustainable use, workforce development, outreach, and cultural integration. These targets can help show our partners the broader impact which they are having and tie it to the global metrics. So Laukahi essentially serves as a data aggregation hub. We compile information from all our partners to get a big picture view of the state of plant conservation in Hawaii. Different targets require a different set of partner data, and that is why we need such a wide range of stakeholders involved. The diversity of the targets you see here require a diverse set of partners, all actively contributing to accomplish the goals. So here is our network. Partners are grouped by activities, including Nc2 work, Nc2 fieldwork, and outreach and education. As you can see, many partners fall into more than one category. Lyon Arboretum was the first to sign the charter, and they donate office space. Laukahi is a program of the Hawaii Conservation Alliance Foundation, and that acts as our fiscal sponsor. The network is guided by 8-member advisory council, currently made up of representatives from government and state agencies, universities, and botanical gardens. These are our partners so far. We have roughly 40 member organizations and 20 or so other entities who partner with us on data sharing, adopting common standards, contracting, and outreach. We've recently been focused on how to track data, and we'll provide a status report on all 20 outcome-oriented targets. After analysis, we can then identify what targets have been closer to accomplishing or where more work is needed. Also, our partners are able to see where they fit in the larger state of the global biodiversity conservation. As of now, 7 targets are complete or near complete. Around 10 have been initiated and some process of working towards being complete. And 3 targets are currently have projects that are being drafted. Some of the targets that are complete, they will waver a bit between, near complete and complete because they'll require a bit of maintenance. And some of the projects that have been initiated have just started, but we have pathways to continue them. All right, so I'm gonna jump into them. The first target is an online flora of native Hawaiian plants. This was a great target to start with because before the strategy even drafted targets, this was complete. So it was completed before the strategy started because we have so many great programs and websites that share information, pictures, and taxonomy about native Hawaiian plants. And so we worked to have them as our partners to find out how Laukahi can support this effort. And one of the ways is through our Laukahi's Rare Plant Group, which is the Hawaii Rare Plant Restoration Group, which also serves as our Iucn Species Survival Commission group, the Hawaiian Islands Plant Specialist Group. This group actually started in the 1990s, but has kind of fallen under the Laukahi umbrella as we move forward and has a subcommittee on taxonomy subcommittee, where we try to meet regularly with partners who are tracking information about native plants, seeing if there's new publications, if there's changes to be made to the accepted taxonomy list, if there's questions or any discrepancies, we meet and we go over those. Target 2 is an annual assessment of the conservation status of all known plant species to guide conservation action. So these are tracking our species of conservation importance, the SCI. When we first developed the list, there were 724 taxa in 2012. So that's gone up a bit over the years. We haven't been able to do it annually, and that's something we'll probably revisit the need for when we review our targets. But I just wanted to point out that around close to 40 of the taxa are likely extinct. So the total number of extant SCI currently is a little bit closer to 750. If you break that number down, most of them are federally listed as threatened and endangered species. The majority of those are listed as endangered. There are also some other rare species that have been red listed through the Iucn process and identified as critically endangered or endangered, but aren't federally listed. And also some species that our the Plant Extinction Prevention Program in Hawaii works on, have identified them as species that have 50 or fewer individuals remaining in the wild, but are not currently federally listed. And then the other group of species on here are more common species from the state of Hawaii's State Wildlife Action Plan, and species that have been in cultivation or have known cultural value. We've tried to include as many as we could to that group as well, and that makes up the total number of SCI. Target 3 is a bit of a mouthful, but an access-restricted central information management system for compiling and administering geospatial and tabular data sets on biological data. So this one we're most excited about right now. I'll be showing you a lot of screenshots. Hopefully you can see them, and if we have time, I can jump on the mock-up of this and look a little bit more at these targets. So we've entered into a partnership with a new Laukahi member organization, the Bishop Museum. And the Bishop Museum is upgrading the existing Laukahi database and developing a dashboard to display our partners' progress toward the Hawaiʻi Strategy. This tool will allow us and our partners and the public to visualize our progress with the targets in real time. We hope to have this completed by the end of the calendar year, in which the dashboard will be live on the Laukahi website. Target 4 is to identify research gaps. So starting in 2012, and then I think maybe once or twice other times since then, we've done a survey to see what research is being conducted on the Hawaiian flora and look for gaps to see what research maybe should be targeted. We keep track of new publications that have come out and share that quarterly with all of the members so they can see what new research papers have been published. And then we keep track in the database of the subjects or topics regarding those publications so that we can show which areas there's been research and then specifically look for which areas there haven't. We've identified needs, for example, that there was a lot of questions and lack of research on genetic analysis of native plants. And so that actually was able to, and I know some of you have been involved and incredibly supportive and helpful. We're currently holding a rare plant genetics workshop That's a 10-part series that we just started in October. And we're able to use results of surveys like this to help identify topics for the agenda of what we should focus on and the information that we wanted to share and further better understand. Target 5 is at least 15% of each ecological region or vegetation type is secured through effective management and or restoration. So we measure this currently by effective management, which we define as areas where feral ungulates are not present. Those areas are most often fenced to exclude feral ungulates, including pigs, deer, goats, sheep, cattle, which are considered primary threats to native habitats and plants. We protect habitats by constructing ungulate exclusion fences and outplanting only into fenced areas. We meaning the conservation community as a whole, not Laukahi specifically. Restoration really cannot take place where feral ungulates are present. Lots of fundraising goes into fence construction and maintenance. After construction, there are costs to remove ungulates inside, as well as long-term costs to monitoring fences for damage or breaches, and then respond to repair or remove ungulates if they get in. So on this figure, and this data is courtesy of our partners at the State Division of Forestry and Wildlife. This shows a map of the main Hawaiian Islands and the percentage of habitat that is fenced or proposed to be so in the near future. So you can see some islands have met this target while some islands have fallen short. And we are also able to break this down by habitat type. So across all islands to identify the habitat types that have met this goal and track that over time, as well as the ones that haven't, and therefore further protection are needed. So the metrics for these targets can change, but for right now, this is where we're starting with this, tracking this target by looking at habitat that's protected from feral ungulates. Target 6 is our first target. We haven't quite gotten off the ground yet, and I will explain why. So at least 75% of the most important areas for plant diversity of each ecological region are protected with effective management. So we have yet to identify what the most important areas for plant diversity are, or how we're going to define that and how we're going to track that. So this is one where we need help with this target. This image shows the change in habitat type over time, and this is just an example of the island of Oʻahu, but is similar to other islands as well. And I'm just sharing this to highlight that while there's native habitat intact currently, so much has been lost that we can't ignore all the purple as far as habitats and areas that are going to be important to plant diversity. So we really need to work with our partners to figure out what areas need additional protection and what these most important areas are. Target 7 is at least 75% of known threatened plant species are conserved in Nc2. So this has been started, but much work is needed. To better tackle this target, we need a better understanding of the current status of all the SCI, so where they are, how healthy their populations are. So we want to do an Nc2 assessment similar to the Nc2 assessment that we did, where for the Nc2 assessment, we got inventories from all botanical gardens and seed banks, micropropagation, all Nc2 facilities, nurseries from all of our partners who held SCI, and evaluated those collections for how well representative they were for the species. and we're able to summarize and report that information. So we feel that this, to reach target 7, that we've been developing and drafting and planning how best to do this. But there have been a lot of progress made. And one of the examples I'm just showing here is a work with our rare plant group, of the Hawaiʻi Plant Specialist Group, where they work to identify the location names, and sort of subdivide areas throughout all the islands, so that we were kind of all on the same page with the areas we were referring to, and start to break down and get a better assessment within each area, and use the same language and coding to sort of track these areas throughout the islands. And that was viewed as maybe one step towards sort of figuring out how to tackle an assessment of all of the species of conservation importance that are currently extant. Another thing that we have focused on is working with our partners at USGS. So in 2013, there was a climate vulnerability assessment completed for all native Hawaiian plants, and they identified current climate envelopes which are suitable for those species, as well as future climate envelopes, so that you could see where the overlap was, or in more dire situations where the overlap wasn't. And within that overlap, we are able to work with partners to identify the species where there wasn't habitat protection, so there wasn't a fence. And those are the sort of tools that we feel like we can help provide to generate lists of species where there are these actions that we can share with our partners that might be really helpful for the long-term management in the field. Target 8 is at least 75% of species of conservation importance are secured with adequate Nc2 collections. So this is where we started. This goal had been met when we did the first assessment in 2012, and then we did it again last year in 2020 around this time, and saw that we had a slight increase in the number of SCI that were represented. And just the process of doing this assessment has been so valuable because, for example, after the 2020 assessment, we were able to identify the species that weren't represented, that we couldn't find any collections of them, and they were species that were federally listed, or they were even species that we knew had 50 or fewer individuals in the wild. And so this became a target list that we could go back to our partners and share and say, oh, we've noticed, we're having trouble finding these. And that just allows the conversation, and the data sharing, the collaboration to identify why haven't we been able to make these collections, and what can we do, or what do we need so that we are able to protect these species. Target 9 is collections of at least 20% of SCI are available for outplanting. So we do survey with our partners and identify that around 60% of SCI have been outplanted. So we're able to track if they've been outplanted, and this is, again, a target we could further refine the metrics for, and really dial down on availability. But as of now, we're at least able to know that around 60% have been outplanted. Target 10 is that collections are duplicated when possible at Nc2 facilities. And we noticed that progress has also been made with this target. So in 2012, we had around half of the SCI in more than one facility, and that's risen to 83% as of last year. So we're really happy about that. And again, it's just generating these lists where we can identify how many facilities, and our partners are eager to figure out the best ways to share collections and build redundancy throughout the Nc2 facilities. Target 11 doesn't directly relate to a target in the global strategy, but focuses on conservation or management plans to have them available for each species. So for the majority of the SCI, we can refer to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plans. And those have been completed for most of the federally listed species, or they have been drafted. The other thing that we've done to work towards this target is Iucn Red Listing. So when the IUCN's World Conservation Congress was in Honolulu in 2016, to get ready for that, we, as a group, tried to make a push with our partners to do more red listing for native plants. And while the red list assessment as its own isn't necessarily a conservation or management plan, it can be developed into one, and at least it pulls all the data together for each of the species, and then we can work with our partners to identify conservation actions that are needed. So we have around 200 species still to tackle, and we'll try to continue by starting with the red list assessment as the first step in this process. Target 12 is effective management plans and biosecurity measures are in place to prevent new biological invasions. So our partners at CGAPS, the coordinating group on alien pest species, has a biosecurity plan, and they're currently tracking the implementation of that. So we're linked into their reporting on this image, and we try to support their efforts where we can. This project, this biosecurity plan, is part of CGAPS, the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, and the University of Hawaii's Pacific Cooperative Studies Unit. So target 13 is the other one we haven't quite started yet, and that's because it, like target 6, relates to these important areas of plant diversity that we're still working to define and to make sure that they're not negatively impacted by biological invasions. So this one, we have our partners in place, and we know that the Nc2 assessment that we want to do, as well as defining these important plant areas, will really help us move forward on this target. So for the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, there is an invasive species committee on each island, and they target novel incipient species, invasive species for eradication. However, naturalized, widespread invasive species are much more difficult to control, require many more resources and support and collaboration, and lots of work has been done to try to tackle this, but much more work is needed. And I just would point out that invasive species are the primary driver of extinction in Hawaii. So target 14 is trained people working in facilities according to local needs are sufficient to achieve the goals of the strategy. So this again is a survey that Laukahi conducts to identify how many people are working in plant conservation in the state. And on this map here, you can see the chart breaks it down by island. It shows that there are more people, the most people are on the island of Oʻahu, and I just want to point out that while that includes people working on Oʻahu specifically, it also includes a lot of administrative or statewide positions tend to be on the island as well, which probably contributes to the higher number. This is just another way to break it down. We asked categories for roles of people, and the large majority, it's probably hard to see here, I apologize for that. The purple is restoration and management positions. So most people identified as being in restoration or management positions. Fewer people identified as being in research, at botanical gardens, in education or administration, just for example. Target 15 is to increase the capacity to provide adequate infrastructure for Nc2 facilities and to improve access and facilitate inter-island transport. So Laukahi has a grant through Patagonia to facilitate the movement of propagules between islands. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, a lot of the collections that are made go to, a lot of the collections that are made in the field on all the islands will go to Oʻahu, where Lyon Arboretum is the lead repository for rare plants, for seed banking, micropropagation, cryopreservation, and so material often goes to Oʻahu, and then they'll have plants that need to go back to the home island. And so Laukahi helps with that simple transport of propagules. It's been a little subdued due to the pandemic, but we're still able to provide that service and look forward to continuing to do so. On this slide, the number that's circled in red are the number of Nc2 facilities identified on each island. And then below that are the number of species of conservation importance. They don't all add up to the total because a lot of the species of conservation importance are found on more than one island, but we just wanted to provide that information. And working with our Nc2 partners and trying to target what the needs are and where we can help support them. I also want to mention that we do have facilities that we partner with on the continent as well. So at the University of California, Irvine, there's a greenhouse that has the largest collection of the Hawaiian endemic genus Schedia, where there's around 34 species. We work closely with them to get seeds into the seed banks on Kauai and Oʻahu. We have also, since the late 1990s, worked with the National Laboratory Genetic Resources Preservation in Fort Collins, Colorado, on seed storage behavior within the flora, and recently have started working with the Cincinnati Zoo Botanical Garden and Lyon Arboretum to develop cryopreservation protocols for Hawaiian plants where their seeds are not orthodox and can't be stored conventionally, dried and cooled in seed banks. Target 16 is partnerships for plant conservation are established. The metric we use for this are the number of Laukahi partners over time. So right now, I think this is up to date. We have 41 partners, and I hope that's what we've been tracking over time. And we'll continue to track that, as well as continually look for new partners, especially outside of Hawaii, where we could get more involved, especially throughout the Pacific and Oceania. So target 17 and 18, we just started working on. 17 is the broad public understanding of the natural and cultural value of Hawaii's native plants. And 18 is plant conservation in Hawaii is promoted to national and international conservation groups. So for 18, we've identified the metric. We're considering tracking the amount of presentations, so such as this one today, or outreach events that our partners participate in. And for 17, we have started looking at pulling together the information that we get from our botanical garden partners of how much visitation there's been to their facilities, and have also started to look at how to track plant conservation presence on social media as ways to meet these two targets. But these are still, we're trying to work out those metrics. Target 19 is similar to the first one in that it was kind of done before the target was drafted. So we're happy to have this one met as well. No native plant species are endangered by commercial trade. So the state of Hawaii has a program where if you're a commercial grower, if you want to sell an threatened or endangered plant species, you apply through the state. And if they approve it, they give you a tag that you put with your plant that says, I'm an endangered plant, and you can use me to in your home or in your garden, but not anywhere else. So it's supposed to make sure that plants that are sold through commercial trade are not being used for restoration projects. Some of them have just, been in cultivation for many years and we didn't want that material to be used for restoration. So hopefully we'll continue working with our state of Hawaii partners and figuring out how best to track and understand our progress towards this goal. One of our endangered native gardenias is the highest selling. I know this is probably way too hard to see, is our highest selling plant. And then target 20 is indigenous and local knowledge, innovations, and practices associated with plant resources are maintained or increased. We have, this is the top, have been identified as the top priority to start with our new network coordinator. The project's been drafted and reviewed and funded. And what we hope to do is to document the Hawaiian names and uses for all species of conservation importance, and hope that it's not just a literature review, but are able to just talk to people throughout the state to identify names and uses for these species, and then share that with the public. And one of the goals of this is to be able to overlap this effort with where species of conservation importance are in cultivation, to enable practitioners to have better access to plant materials. So just to share, both where they are in collections and facilitate that, that connection. So what's next for the Hawaiʻi Strategy for Plant Conservation? We are awaiting the global strategy, which ended in 2020. They're revising their targets. And when those are available, we can go back to our advisory council and to all of our partners and discuss maybe how to revise our targets if we see a value for that. And so we're looking forward to that process. So to summarize, Laukahi has 3 major roles in plant conservation. We support, subsidize, and summarize. We support our members by facilitating communication and collaborative projects that will help reach our goals. We also support our partners with tools and knowledge to make their jobs easier where we can. We can subsidize our partners' programs when we show the need for collaboration and we work together with our partners on projects that we get funded for or support for. Also, our partners are able to leverage the Hawaiʻi Strategy to fund projects that will meet targets independently. And finally, we summarize our partners' efforts by analyzing and reporting on the entire network's progress on protecting the health of our plants and ecosystems. I really appreciate the invitation to share about how Laukahi is tracking progress on plant conservation. As a coordinator for plant recovery at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I do often feel overwhelmed. As Laukahi can mean 400, which is less than the number of federally listed plants our office works to recover. That's almost half of the listed plants in the country. However, these numbers force us and show us how to rely on data management and data sharing, and most importantly, collaboration, to share all the successes and failures and move forward together. And as you all know, whether a species is listed or not is not the cutoff for needing protection. And with the onslaught of a variety of threats, native plants and functioning resilient habitats are vital. Laukahi aims to be synergistic in its efforts to share, report, and support all efforts to protect plants in their homes, and help members by tracking the data, and when reported can highlight the value of all of our efforts. So I really look forward to continuing this partnership. And mahalo nui for allowing me to share, and thank you all so much for having me.
Fabulous presentation and gorgeous pictures. Thank you. So as we turn to the Q&A part of our meeting, I'll just start by saying, if anyone has any questions, you can either, I think we might still be a small enough group, but maybe you should raise your hand if you can figure out how to use that function, or you can put information into the chat box. And so why don't I go ahead, I actually will just open up the floor to any questions, and I'll just wait a moment. And I guess if you'd like to just turn on your microphone and ask a question, go ahead. Be sure to introduce yourself again. Okay, I'll give people a chance to think, and I will, oh good, great, because I do have a question too, but let's let Jenna go. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi, Lauren. I'm Jenna from Utah. I also work in a service ES office. So I'm feeling a little overwhelmed for you too, thinking about all of those listed plants. Our state, has 26 federally listed plants. So the numbers you're talking about are super overwhelming. But my question, because I find this topic fascinating and I really like the collaboration piece and how you're leveraging resources. Can you speak a bit about the structure of the network, kind of the hierarchy? I know you mentioned there's an advisory council or board or something like that. So I'm interested in learning more about that. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I enjoy, hearing about the work that other people are doing with listed plants in their state, because I am always excited for, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And like you mentioned with the collaboration, I feel like we're always learning something new that we can apply to each other. So thanks so much. As far as the structure, we have, so the advisory council has a few positions that have been more long-term, and then a few positions where they rotate like around every 2 years or so. And within that group, we identify some like subcommittees in focus. So there's some members of the advisory council are more involved with the database and the data management, and other members are involved in other targets, like the outreach and education aspects. And so as the network coordinator, right, has a job that's overwhelming in and of itself to track the progress on these 20 targets. And that leads to so many projects that Laukahi could be involved in. So there's the advisory council helps to support the network coordinator, and the network coordinator is a one person position, and then we try to get help, interns, other student hires, other positions that can help that network coordinator. And then a lot of the fundraising also that goes along with Laukahi's efforts is then to contract work to be done, right? So a lot of the work is then contracted for those discrete sort of projects that Laukahi gets support for. And those are usually, partners within the network or new people to start to work with. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So that advisory committee, is that a mix of federal and non-federal, or strictly non-federal?
It's a mix. And it's mostly non-federal. So right now there's members from Lyon Arboretum at the University of Hawaiʻi, the state, Maui Nui Botanical Garden, and then sorry, I know I'm missing. I don't want to miss any advisory members, but some of the positions have been there. For instance, the role at Lyon Arboretum and the National Tropical Botanical Garden, they initially pulled together the funds to support the research to look into if we should start a network, and that was done with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So those positions have been people have represented those organizations regularly on the advisory council, but we also want the other, members to be rotating to bring in new people and get new guidance and input. So we meet annually, all of the members, and at that time identify those positions that are available, and then people are nominated for filling those roles.
Great, thank you so much.
Yep.
So Lauren, a question I had was, and I think this was just a matter of, I just kind of, maybe I phased out for a moment, but you had a slide that talked about fences, and I don't know if you were talking about that in like a metaphorical sense, or are you using that to imply that there's a conservation collection and is that what the fence is? I wasn't quite sure. Could you explain that?
Sure. No, definitely. So target 5, it wasn't metaphorical in that sense. So target 5 is specifically to look at areas across the landscape. So that is more of a throughout the islands, what areas, what habitats are protected or have management in place. So that target and that group of targets relates to field management and habitat protection. So the goal is to have, the target currently is to have 15% of each ecoregion managed. So if we define that as where there are ungulate fences, that means that those are areas where feral ungulates are not. And so we highlight there isn't restoration, there isn't a way to protect plants where feral ungulates are present. And so we identify the areas where they're not present as the areas that right now have effective management. I think, like, for example, for outplanting, our recommendations, our best practices for rare plants or for all plants is that you would conduct those in areas where there are feral ungulates are absent. So they would limit the success of being able to do that restoration activity, because they would pull up and eat those plants once you plant it. So, in our permits and in our management practices and stuff, we recommend doing that in areas that are free of ungulates. Does that make sense? Does that make more sense? Sorry.
Yes, because I did know that issue about the feral pigs and stuff, and so I wasn't sure if it was literal or not. And so I thought, well, anyway, I appreciate you explaining that. The other thing that I was curious about is the other strategy, which number I can't remember, but when you started talking about how you realized that a bunch of the plants were even federally listed and that hadn't really been, looked at or assessed. Do you find that having done that and showing that need has helped inform how the Fish and Wildlife Service has taken on a program of work, or did Hawaii does Laukahi have sort of an in to the state wildlife action plans, and that information could be incorporated in that way?
So for the, I think that's target, the one in referring to the management plans or conservation plans. I think the goal of that is to, we said, okay, these are the species of conservation importance. These are the species that need one or many conservation actions to protect them. And so we want to make sure that we are able to provide those actions and make those available. And for the species that are federally listed, those have largely been available through that listing process, identifying the threats, identifying recommendations, utilizing the recovery plans and identifying the actions in there. And then for the species of conservation importance that aren't federally listed, we've been working on that group. Laukahi has been working with the partners on that group to identify those conservation actions. And yes, some of them are in the state's wildlife action plan. Other documents that the state produces for like their natural areas, they'll have management plans and call out species in there. So Laukahi will work, with the literature and then all the partners to pull all that together. And then for the species that haven't been assessed by the red listing process, that also helps identify, just to document even the status and then start to identify the conservation actions that might be needed for each species.
Great. Great. And do we have any more questions? Maybe Matt wants to say something. No, I guess his mic is hot, but he's not saying anything.
Now you have to say something.
Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Sorry about that.
Okay, great. Do we have any more questions? Oh, yeah, there's a hand up. And it's
Hi,
Paul.
my name's Paul Jarina. I work for the Air Force and Natural Resources technical support. So I'm curious, and this may be to the general audience, but specifically, I've been always having this question about location of species and like mapping of that, and wondering, is there some restrictions? I know in the Department of Interior and the Park Service, there's restrictions, but I can't see any regulation out there that says you can't share that information. And or did I open up Pandora's box here?
Yeah.
No, that's okay. So I mentioned the Hawaii Rare Plant Restoration Group. That is similar to Laukahi. It's partners who are working on rare plant recovery and restoration throughout the state. And we put together a list of, we focus on developing best practices. A lot of times we work with the Center for Plant Conservation on that as well. But best management practices, standard operating procedures that we as a group feel like are important, and location information. And it comes up a lot, so it's a great thing to talk about. It's just, and I'd be interested to hear how people handle it elsewhere, because it's something that I think is valuable to discuss. But we do recommend that you don't disclose specific locations, specifically for a lot of rare plant species where they're just so rare and the habitats are so fragile, that, as conservation programs, as the state, as the Plant Extinction Prevention Program do their work, they even prioritize where they go to not have too much of a human impact on the area. So, just sensitive locations, sensitive to impacts, and we want to do all that we can to protect those species. And so over collection and over visitation are identified as threats. So we try to provide that information just to the community of how best to make those connections with each of these species. We offer volunteer opportunities. We offer outreach opportunities, and try to figure out the best and safest ways to build those connections, where a lot of the areas are not only sensitive, but difficult to access, and it's a human health thing as well as a plant and habitat health thing. So we're eager to work with everyone to figure out the best ways to do that. But we do have, if you go to Patricia, can I share my screen again? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So on the Laukahi website at laukahi.org, you can go to this HRPRG link, which is the Rare Plant Group. And it lists all of our resources and guidelines and includes guidelines for responsible viewing of rare native plants, as well as a brochure that we try to share at outreach events of the things you can do to protect rare plants. So keep your distance, follow the laws, disable your location information when you take photographs with your phone, those kinds of things. Biosecurity stuff, make sure your gear is clean. So we try to put that all together in a document.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I got it on rare plants, and I understand that. I mean, it's a long story, but you know, sharing those locations, especially with partners, and then making sure, let's give an example, you want to tell people that's at an installation, you need an area during these times for the species or for those rare plants or whatnot. I think it's key because they need to know, here's some guidelines so that they're not making any kind of threats to or endangering the plants or impacting those plant species or even animal species.
Paul, you raise a good point. That's a really great issue, and it's something that I think we grapple with a lot across the federal agencies, and also in this information age where more and more information is being digitized, and there's just real concerns because even non-imperiled species can be impacted by having their locality data put out there. And it's tough for me because as an armchair botanist who does a lot of sort of big picture information looking at different species, it is really helpful to have things like the California Native Plant Society. Their Cal Flora was just fantastic. And a few years ago, I was looking into a species of Luisia, and it was just really helpful to have that information accessible to me. But I'm not going to go out there and collect it and try to sell it or whatever. And so I think that is a real problem. And on our last Plant Conservation Alliance phone call, I think it was the general meeting, but I'm not sure. I actually was telling folks about an incident of plant poaching that occurred because of, I think it was the iNaturalist app, and data was put out there, and there are people who look for that. That's what they do for their job. They look for that data, and then they go out and they take those plants and they sell them. Yeah. And so I think that it turned out that I believe Bureau of Land Management and some California state authorities, and I think Fish and Wildlife, are working with iNaturalist to try to make sure locality data is protected. But I do think that it's been an issue among the agencies as well about whether or not we're allowed to keep that information offline. There's some kind of weird thing that almost requires us to put it out there. Anyway.
Yeah, it's I'm grappling with it because of controlled unclassified information guidance. So it a long story on that, but that's the new title of for official use only.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So a lot of times that guidance basically specifies if you have a specific regulation, you cite that, and then you say you limit distribution to that. So I get it. It's hard. I mean, this is a hard issue because you want to know. I mean, if you want a population estimate, or if you want some good knowledge of range or expanse of that species, you really need those locales, right? So, and then understanding that and getting that kind of message to either the new botanist out there, the new ecologist, you name it, making sure that the engagement is there, so they're trained. Okay, here's this example, and how do you get that? How do you get that engagement? Because I mean, for plants, it's always a numbers game. There's a lot of plants. There's not a lot of people doing the research compared to the wildlife side. So I just put forth that.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And Anne, I don't know if you have a mic, if you want to mention what you've put in the chat um, about these issues. Because the point that, go ahead.
Hear me? Yeah, I don't have my headset. I'm sorry, but yeah. So I currently work for the USDA. I'm not with the NatureServe network anymore. But one of the things that the NatureServe network and the heritage programs have, they haven't completely figured out, but they have a lot of experience with this. Is that locality data for rare species that's held by state agencies or universities in heritage program, it has it can't be released through FOIA, and in part that's because it contains information collected on private land through private landowner permission. And so, because rare species occur, of course, on public and private land. So federal agencies, if the origin of that locality data is somehow housed by heritage or connected to heritage, there is some protection that's offered there. Also, iNaturalist used to, and I'm not up on this, but they used to have something in place that would automatically fuzz the exact locality of rare species that were ranked G1 or G2 by NatureServe. But there are all kinds of other portals, particularly, herbarium specimens or other, bison is another one through the USGS that rely on the user submitting the data to indicate if they want it fuzzed or not. So if I'm a world expert on some very rare plant, I collect a specimen and submit it, and I do not click that it should be fuzzed, it will not be fuzzed. There's nothing in place. And so the onus is on the data collector, unless we as a community want to change that and try to put some restrictions on these data aggregator sites saying if it's listed as whatever, critically endangered or endangered by the red list or ranked G1, G2 by NatureServe, it should automatically be fuzzed. There are people in the plant community that have had conversations about it. It just hasn't, I don't know where they stand right now, but yeah.
Yeah, that's good info. I mean, really, it's one of those things that I think about it because I've used iNaturalist in the past, and so I was like, okay, now I see that, and that's not the only one. So
no, I know
you name the app and you name the types of species. They even have it for herps. So they got a herp mapper. So I didn't mean to dive off, but I'm just saying that that's for the plants. I can see where this is key because you got to fuzz it. I mean, and there's particular fuzzable location or obfuscate it if you want to use that word, because we've done that for archaeological sites and cultural resource sites, because we have a law that says you can't let that out. You can't show that. So it's a big blob. And for obvious reasons, right? So anyway, thank you. Appreciate it. Love the presentation.
Yes. Do we have any more questions for Lauren? Okay, well, thank you so much, Lauren. And we hope that you'll stay with us for this last half hour of the call if we stay on that long. This next part is actually the roundtable, where we invite anyone on the call to speak up about any native plant information, work, publications, meetings, events, anything going on that you'd like to share. So with that in mind, would anybody like to share information on upcoming events or new publications? I can tell you for the Fish and Wildlife Service, again, I normally try to coordinate with folks before this to see what's going on around the agency that might be of interest. But one thing that is going on is that I don't know how many of you are familiar with the America the Beautiful report that was put out, that was released in a couple months ago, to talk about how the government agencies are going to work together to basically, restore and work hard to conserve and restore our lands. And one of the things that's happening in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I think it might be happening among the other agencies as well, is that they're standing up little teams inside our agency that are going to work on the various aspects of that undertaking. And I think that's the if somebody could help me, if they know that there's a saying, the 30 by 30, where they're by 2030, 30% of land will be conserved or restored, I think is what that's called.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there's 6 sort of subject areas that are interesting, and I think it'll be interesting to see how those get how those play out. Some of them have to do with, better engagement with tribal audiences, but in a way that isn't just, it's actually attempting to learn more, to put it in a position of let's learn from them, from our, Indigenous colleagues. And let's see, restoration, underserved communities, like plant deprived or nature deprived communities. So it should be really interesting to see how that pans out.
Patricia, this is Lori with the Park Service, and I just wanted to mention that we are working on compiling some of our pieces for the America the Beautiful report also, and trying to understand the role we want to play and how we can best play the role in the 30 by 30 initiative and working with our parks across the country. And as you mentioned in the beginning of the meeting too, we're carefully watching the infrastructure bill and what comes from that. So it's an exciting time, really, with some of the potential increases of funds that we could invest in habitat and plants and ecosystem restoration. So it's been an exciting couple of weeks in the Park Service, and I don't have anything other, specific to share, but just wanted to say we're watching patiently to see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. Great. All right. Any more updates? Anyone is welcome to talk. If you're doing a invasive species pull, anything. Always a quiet crowd. I've got to figure out how to make you guys talk. Okay, so I'm just checking really quickly because I thought I had a note to myself of something else I would like to share, but I don't see it. So I guess with that, I'll just say thanks again for attending today's meeting. We do try to share summary notes shortly after the meeting. We're a bit late on last 2 months ago's notes. That's my fault. But hopefully anyone who attends the meeting will be getting a quick summary at some point down the line to include links and things like that for what was talked about in the meeting. And I'd like to encourage you to consider joining the Plant Conservation Alliance listservs. I don't know if Maggie could throw that web link into the chat, because that is how we inform people of upcoming meetings, if that's not how you found out about today's meeting. And it's also two-way. Those are two-way listservs for you also to post information, ask questions, share, success stories and whatever. So I really encourage you to become involved on the listservs with us as well. I want to thank you for meeting with us today. Stay tuned to the PCA meetings page. By the end of the year, we hope to have next year's slate of speakers up for next year's meetings. And thanks again. Take care.
Thank
See you in
you.
January.
Thanks.